Hi, my name is Phoebe Chan, and my presentation is on Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day was known for her contributions to the Catholic worker movement as a journalist and social activist. Most importantly, she is known for her love and devotion for the poor. She fully embodied the Catholic social teachings through her radical advocacy for justice and peace. With the influence of Peter Marin, the movement's aim was to immerse the gospel and the church into social and political issues of the day. Peter Marin instigated the vision of how to remake the world according to a three-part program: agronomic universities, roundtable discussions, and houses of hospitality. As part of their legacies, the Catholic Worker today publishes newspapers to spread the ideologies and opens House of Hospitality to serve the poor by dedicating themselves to voluntary poverty, works of mercy, and pacifism. Dorothy's commitment to the Catholic worker movement demonstrates her faithfulness to the truth of the gospel by mediating God's love through her passion for social reform and social justice. Dorothy Day was born in 1897 on Pineapple Street in Brooklyn, New York. She was the middle of 5 siblings with 3 brothers and a younger sister, Della. Her father, John Day, was a sports writer and a journalist, which often took the family to travel from city to city. In 1905, the family relocated to San Francisco, and in the following year, an earthquake that hit the city had a profound effect on the young Dorothy. She saw her neighbors stripped everything they had to give to others. Her witness to the community in times of helplessness echoes through her teachings as she saw the love and joy of doing good by sharing what one had with others. After the earthquake, the family moved to South Side in Chicago, which deeply moved young Dorothy to identify closely with the poor. With Della and her baby brother John, Dorothy would explore the poorer sections of the West Side. They would push John in a stroller to discover the odd corners of the ghetto, which she witnessed the poverty around her. Her social awareness heightened through the writings of Jack London and Uptown Sinclair's The Jungle, which described the conditions of the stockers of Chicago and the struggles of the poor, especially unjust treatment of the workers. During this time, Dorothy was introduced to the Christian faith and regularly attended Episcopal church. She discovered the practice of personal devotion when she found a sense of beauty and joy through her neighbor Mrs. Barrett, who prayed on her knees in her apartment in deep devotion to God. She began to replicate Mrs. Barrett's devotion by praying in the same kneeling posture at night until her knees ached. At the age of 16, Dorothy attended the University of Illinois in Urbana. She grew critical towards religious people who seem at ease in the face of injustices in the world. She could not associate herself with self-satisfied churchgoers, which she believed she needed to cut out of her life. Her hunger and passion for social justice were found in the social activists who were seeking justice. Through them, she was able to discover radical intellectual and political response to social inequality that was happening with the urban injustices and the workers' plight. She joined the Socialist Party and adopted the Marxist slogan, "Religion is the opiate of people." She rejected her faith and instead committed to social change and work of justice. She believed religion served as a drug to mask the pain of injustice rather than actively encouraging social changes to eliminate injustice's root cause. Dorothy left university to join her family who had moved to New York City. Living in the city, the poverty of the people and her own burdens of loneliness overwhelmed her. Working as a journalist, she associated herself with both communists and socialists at the time. She was constantly involved in anti-war demonstrations and protest. Her active social life further confirmed her commitment to Marxism. On November 1917, she went to Washington, D.C. with a group of women to protest on behalf of women's suffrage. They formed a picket line across from the White House and were arrested in the women's federal prison. In 1918, she worked as a nurse in Kings County Hospital, as she was constantly seeking activity to help the hurt and oppressed. Despite of her abandonment to her faith, she caught herself seeking after the scriptures and prayer. With her persistence in prayer, she led herself to trust in the instinct of prayer when in difficult situations. Dorothy lived in a spiritual restlessness in search of a different community and a different way of being. She had a love affair with Lionel Moyse, and for this reason she quit nursing and had an abortion. After Moyse left her as he said he would, Day undertook a rebound marriage with Berkeley Toby, and they traveled the world together. During that time, she wrote her popular autobiographical novel, The 11th Virgin. In 1924, a Hollywood studio paid $5,000 for movie rights for her novel, and she used the money to buy a cottage in Staten Island. Her relationship among the political radicals and the journalists did not deliver the abundant life she sought. On the island, she was able to find peace and new inspiration for her writing, and I quote, Marxism had been tried and found woefully wanting. Hedonism had not satisfied her lust for abundant life. After drinking deeply of both, Staten Island served first as a refuge from chaos and then as a site of new creation. Later in her life, living with her common-law husband Forster Batterham, a biologist and anarchist, Dorothy discovered not only the beauty of human fulfillment, but an awareness, a gift, that was not her own making. Dorothy unleashed a sense of gratitude which turned her toward the only reality she thought she could explain, the source of all life and being itself. The turning point in Day's conversion was because of the love of Forster and the birth of their daughter Tamar. She grew in recognition of God and the receptivity of His presence in the midst of these loves. She experienced an immense joy and breakthrough to wholeness. She found herself praying and praying with thanksgiving through an internal eruption. And I quote, Although Batterham did not believe in God, Day claimed her life with Him and brought her a natural happiness that brought her closer to God. Through her love for creation, she brought to the Creator all things, and in her happiness she found herself praying. Such experience created her natural sense to pray and her willingness to find God in the most unlikely persons and situations. Because of her newfound faith, Day began a journey of long loneliness in search of community with God. Her common-law husband, Forster, was an atheist and could not accept Dorothy's commitment to religion and her belief in God. He was not in favor of Day's desire to have Tamar baptized and their marriage solemnized. What mattered to Dorothy alienated and angered Forster, and their relationship came to an end. Because of her Christian faith, her friends, and even her, thought she was abandoning the socialist cause. Her friends perceived the Catholic Church was part of the oppression, and for this reason, Day wrote a book, From Union Square to Rome, to explain to her communist friends her reasons for faith. The abandonment by Forster and her friends left her feeling alone. Everyone who was close to Day, including her sister Della and her family, did not share the Catholic vision. She felt very much alone as a believer and was even more intensified while working as a single parent of a young child. Dorothy moved back to New York after Tamar contracted malaria while they were living in Mexico. While covering a series of demonstrations in Washington in 1932, Dorothy admired the dedication of communists who were actively organizing these rallies. They were calling for relief for farms and workers during the Great Depression. The situation increased her concern for social situation, which made her feel even more drawn to social action than to her fellow Catholics. Her long loneliness made her yearn deeply for love that originated from a community with God. She prayed for discernment and direction for her commitments to political causes of changing social order. Her prayer was answered in an unlikely figure, the street corner preacher and philosopher Peter Marin. Through Marin, she identified her rationality between Catholicism and the radical social change. Peter Marin was a French peasant who emigrated to Canada and United States in search for his Christian vocation. In the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression, Marin found clarification of how Christian ideals could be realized in personal and social life. He believed that Christian mission was to witness faith and justice by returning to the voice of tradition. The Catholic tradition is to bring people back to the guidance of the Spirit by molding one to serve rather than to oppress people. It offers resources to personal and societal transformation, which is demonstrated through the life of Christ. Jesus is at the center of transformation, and by believing Him, one enters a new life and service. Christian communities are to start with the transformation of one's personal life, then the reordering of the larger social life. Social order needs to be placed in perspective. which is to protect and nurture one's journey toward the mystery of God. Participating in the body of Christ is externally manifest the presence of God. Christians will recognize the worthy of every person, not by economic class or political party, but in relationship to God and love for one's neighbor. Any social orders or violence that hinder spiritual development is not acceptable for the movement toward reform. Therefore, it is important to use tradition as a backdrop to critique the present and form a new basis for new social order. Marwan's method of changing social order was to bring back the participation of the body of Christ through love as a community. He played a crucial role in Day's Catholic social thought through his beliefs and ideology, which widened her vision of the Church as a vehicle for social reforms. Together, Dorothy Day and Peter Marwan started the Catholic worker movement. Partnering with Marwan freed her to use her journalistic talents on her two interests, God and the poor. The movement was built on the belief that Christian faith was relational, loving God and loving people. It drew on the lives of a wider community to embrace all people. The foundation of the Catholic worker was based on a three-part program that Marwan believed to promote change in both society and the human heart: ergonomic universities, roundtable discussions, and houses of hospitality. Firstly, ergonomic universities conveyed that farming communes were at the heart of the Catholic worker vision. During the Great Depression, there were concerns about the Christian family values as divorce rate increased and the birth rate declined. Day and Marwan believed that the farming communes would fulfill the immediate needs of the people in the Depression years. People would return to farming and crafts and production as to focus on the needs of people rather than profit. Also, the communes would find resources that were abundant in the countryside but scarce in the city, and doing so would recover the value of cooperation and spiritual dimension of human existence. Therefore, people could participate in the urban industrial society without the sacrifice of patterns of family life. To recruit people to join agronomic universities, roundtable discussions and houses of hospitality were developed as part of the strategies. Secondly, the roundtable discussions were specifically designed to move beyond cultural cliches and prejudice by bringing all people from the community, scholars, middle class, and workers together from diverse backgrounds to provide a mutual understanding of present and future possibilities. Discussions were around learning about problems, determining the ideal situations and outcomes, and finding discernment to move social order from where it was to where it ought to be. Thirdly, the idea of houses of hospitality was derived from Christian hospices, found among early and medieval Christian communities. Hospices would offer shelter, food, and clothing for the poor. They served as a spiritual function to those who would participate in their own salvation to fulfill Christ's command to love and serve one's neighbor. On May 1933, Day and Marwan created a forum to promote his ideas through the Catholic Worker. It was a significant expression of the Catholic radicalism in the United States. The publication was sold for a penny a copy for affordability, and within a few months the circulation had grown from 2,500 to 125,000. The Catholic worker movement became well-known and was thriving in several cities. Not only was the Catholic worker movement known for its paper, but also it was famous for its house of hospitality. The houses of hospitality became a refuge where people could go and stay during the Great Depression. They brought new opportunities to assist the poor. Day was dedicated to voluntary poverty and works of mercy in the house of hospitality. Inspired by Marwan's personalist view, Day believed it was important for people to realize the new community that would allow for one to stand in the face of hardship and injustice. By adopting voluntary poverty, she lived in the house of hospitality by stripping away everything she had. She adopted a simple lifestyle to live with the poor and the outcast, and in the process became poor herself. Day turned to Therese Lisieux as an example of stripping oneself of attachment to material things and to one's very self. Cultivating voluntary poverty in the community created the conditions of trusting and depending on one another. Also, relying on the provisions of God would foster conditions to understand God's love through the works of mercy. Works of mercy also engaged in peaceful protests against injustices. Dorothy used houses of hospitality to deliver works of mercy as a spiritual weapon to battle poverty in the inner cities. She would carry out the actions right in her own neighborhoods with the people on her streets. For example, in 1936 to 1937, when seamen went on strike in New York City, Day housed as many strikers as she could and set up a storefront commissionary near the waterfront. She raised money to feed them for several months. By being hospitable to the strikers, she saw justice and mercy go hand in hand. Her dedication to voluntary poverty and works of mercy and the hospitality allowed her to fulfill her needs of community and reconcile her passions for social actions and her Christian faith. As the most radical aspect of her Christian faith, Day advocated for absolute pacifism, in which she rejected all forms of violence, war, and bloodshed. Her voluntary poverty and acts of mercy were to disarm the structure of violence with love. She wanted to break the cycle of violence which she saw enrich the wealth and destroyed the innocent and the poor. Her commitment to pacifism and her uncompromising opposition to America's participation in World War II were costly. The Catholic worker was floundering as volunteers disagreed with Day's absolute pacifism for soldiers to join the war efforts. She gave an ultimatum which eventually split the movement, and those who disagreed with her stand on war dissociated themselves from her and the movement. Due to the popularity of and the increased participation in war, the contributions and funding decreased. As such, hospices were closed and circulation of the Catholic worker dropped below 20,000. Moreover, in 1949, Peter Marvin passed away. The Catholic worker movement that began in hope had faded into exile. However, the setbacks did not deter Day away from being a strong advocate for pacifism. In 1940s and 1950s, the Catholic worker and the worker communities protested the development of using atomic weapons by distributing lengthy articles and organizing demonstrations in the New York City. In 1955, Dorothy and a small group began protesting during the city's mandatory nuclear defense drills. She argued that regardless of the defense drills, the city could not escape catastrophes and destruction in the events of nuclear attacks. The group was willing to go to jail year after year. Eventually, the number of demonstrators grew due to the increase of public awareness about the ineffectiveness of such exercises. Consequently, in early 1960s, the drills ended. During the Vietnam War, Day persuaded several young men to go to jail instead of joining the army. In 1965, she was involved with an anti-war demonstration in which she encouraged young men to burn their selective service cards. Dorothy's pacifism stood so firm that she refused to pay federal income taxes because substantial portions of the taxes supported the war efforts, whether in the past, current, or future. She publicly declared her unwillingness to pay income taxes and encouraged others to do the same. Dorothy Day frequently traveled to defend her beliefs and condemnation of nuclear warfare and violence. In the 1960s, her trip to Cuba was the most controversial in her career. When the Cuban Revolution was the target of American foreign policy, she traveled to Cuba to witness the revolution firsthand. She gave positive reports about day-to-day life under Castro, and her comments were uncommon for American journalists. Her controversial reports gave insights to the character of the worker movement. Her trip to Cuba was just the beginning of a turbulent decade of wars in which America was involved with. She supported the civil rights movement and later began a dialogue with the Vietnam War. Around the mid-60s, the Catholic worker became a symbol of defiance in the world by fighting against the injustices of wars. Dorothy never backed down from her commitment to respond to poverty, injustice, war, and violence. Because of Day publicly voiced her support of the Cuban Revolution, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the farmer workers campaign, and because she frequently marched, picketed, civilly disobeyed, and endured imprisonment on behalf of these movements, we say she was a woman with passion for justice who put her body on the line. In 1970, she traveled around the world and visited universities and hospitality houses. Her talks with her strong ideologies for pacifism and her works of mercy drew large audiences. She did not stop speaking and traveling until 1980 when she suffered several heart attacks and eventually was hospitalized for heart failure. She was brought home to Mary House where she died on November 29 in the company of her daughter. It was the eve of Advent and Dorothy had just turned 83. Dorothy loved, cared, and was loyal to those who were suffering and in poverty by advocating for them and living among them. Despite of her initial abandonment of faith, she was able to reconcile her passion for social action and her Catholic faith through Peter Marvin. He shared her ideologies that Christian values could be realized in personal and social life through the three-part program. Together, Marvin and Day began the Catholic worker movement by distributing newspapers and opening houses of hospitality to feed the poor and hungry. Dorothy was always committed and dedicated to impoverished, injustice, war, and violence with a full-hearted love. Her commitment to the truth of the gospel and to serve the poor was shown through her legacy and life, which still influences all Christians today. Thank you for listening to my presentation on Dorothy Day. I hope it challenged you to reflect on how, as Christians, we are able to bring about social action and advocacy for the poor, for the hungry, for those who are oppressed or facing injustices around the world.